Welcome back to Cyber Made Human, the podcast where we make complex tech and cyber topics accessible to all. I'm your host, Alice Violet, and this is part 2 of our discussion with criminologist Nakshanthra Suresh. In part 1, we dived into harassment and stranger-based stalking with the misuse of apps like Strava. So if you're interested in that episode, do go and listen and join us back here for part 2. In this episode, we dive into domestic spying from misuse of cat cams, baby cams, the cloud, and we take a question from a listener who needs advice on how to safely regain their privacy while in a controlling relationship. Thanks for listening, and do make sure to subscribe as it helps more people discover the show. Let's get started. It would be great to hear a bit more about your background and Iris and what kind of motivated you to do the studies and the work that you're doing now.
Sure. So my background is in criminology and criminal justice. So I, straight out of high school, I knew I wanted to do something in this space. So went on to do my undergrad in criminology and criminal justice. Right after my bachelor's, I got a job in the federal government here in Australia. And I moved to Canberra, the capital city, and did about 3 years there in Canberra specifically. But my career spanned across policy. I was in law enforcement for about 2 years. And then my last year and a half, 4 years in total, I spent in an oversight role as well. So that the policy work was a lot of intelligence, governance, all sorts of things, but primarily a law enforcement, then changed into an oversight role. So I did a lot of my work in the government. And then at the same time during COVID, I started my master's in criminology and criminal justice. And the main reason for me doing my master's was because I absolutely love crim, and I would talk about it all day if I could. I would probably talk years about it if I could as well. But I was really interested in cybercrime, but not from the traditional lens of people thinking about frauds and phishing and scams and all the hacking that happens. But I've had a number of people very casually at that time in my life very casually talk about stalking. I started thinking about the normalization of stalking and how that translated into a cyber sense, that we were able to, associate harm with one but not the other. So I ended up doing my master's thesis it was a comparative study on stalking and cyber stalking in Australia. And I proposed 3 vignettes to a population group. And one of them was a stalking scenario. They were all hypothetical, and 2 of them were cyber stalking scenarios. And I basically wanted people to evaluate the harm that each scenario would have on, again, a fictional person. And the fictional person was female, and the people who were stalking in each scenario were male. And what I understood as a result of my findings was that people perceived offline stalking to have greater mental health impacts than cyber stalking. And they, for the stalking scenario specifically, they said that the person should go to the police or law enforcement or a regulatory authority or a lawyer. But for the cyber stalking scenarios, they just said report it to the platform. And you could really tell the difference in the way that people perceived both crime types. And I wanted to really dig deeper and further into what are the fundamental differences between stalking and cyber stalking, but also more broadly, what are the differences between physical forms of abuse and cyber abuse, and why do people have these different perceptions? Because if we're all living in this real world where everything happens and it's just a continuum of violence, like where does this contextual collapse actually occur? And what I found was that people actually didn't perceive a threat to anyone's personal safety unless a physical threat had manifested. And that was the same regardless of whatever crime type it was. Unless someone was physically standing at your door, there was no threat that was perceived. And alarming as it is a common sentiment that I've seen across literature, but also just general conversations that I have with people, because it's always an element of victim blaming with any form of cyber abuse, is that you can always log out, you can always, turn off your router. You can always get a new device. You may not even need to use that app. Whereas with physical, it's not like, oh, I can just get up and go to a new location. I can't move out of my house. So they think of all the socioeconomic factors that are associated with physical forms of abuse, and that they associate the cyber abuse as less harmful. As a result of all my research, I realized that one of the big deciding factors when it comes to cyber abuse and the perpetration of cyber abuse as well is that victim survivors are often left with very minimal support from both the legal system, but also as individuals themselves to have freedom of choice as to what they can and shouldn't do. They're often directed on what they shouldn't do, but they don't have the autonomy to decide what, like, if they want to remain on a platform, they should be allowed to remain on that platform without having, this thing hanging over their head being like, oh, I'm going to get abused. I will get abused, or this person will find me, which is how Iris came about. So myself and my co-founder, it's an interesting story. We had just presented our research at a conference in Darwin, and we were standing outside and we were waiting for an Uber. And I kind of turned and I looked at her and I was like, we have very similar research findings. She was like, yeah, I thought that too. And then we were like, okay, we're going to cancel the Uber. I think we should come up with an idea that solves this problem space. So we've obviously been at it for some time now, navigated a number of different solutions, but Iris's aim is to upskill the average adult's digital literacy. Okay. We find that there are some solutions, so very innovative solutions out there for children and young adults. And there's a lot of I have wonderful colleagues in this space. Adam as well. You've interviewed Adam on your podcast. He's an amazing advocate for child safety. Shout out, Adam. Love your work. And we thought with adults, there is less accountability taking place with big tech platforms because they assume the adult does not care enough about their safety and is willing to compromise and overlook a number of risks when it comes to their privacy, the terms and conditions, the amount of trolling or abuse that they could experience just because they want to stay on the platform. And in Australia, the statistic is 1 in 2 Australians will experience at least one form of online abuse in their lifetime.
Wow.
And for me, that is a very harrowing statistic. Obviously, that's resonated across the world and definitely something that is even worse in domestic violence relationships as well, because that is a continuous type of abuse that is perpetrated. In the global south, it is significantly worse as well, as most crime is. So for us at Iris, and also myself as an advocate for online safety, I constantly want to drive the conversation about how people should have the right to stay safe online. I actually believe that it should be added to the list of human rights. Like the United Nations should be able to add that because everyone has the right to stay safe in digital environments. And because our world no longer encompasses just physical spaces, the very need exists for us to just be able to log on, use the internet, and not be abused or trolled or bullied or harassed in any way. And if it does happen, there needs to be some level of accountability from the multiple stakeholders that exist in this environment.
Yeah, definitely. And the onus needs to be put on the person who's being negative, not the victim, to leave the platform, definitely. So the work that you're doing sounds absolutely amazing. And just before we move on to more domestic violence, I'd love to know the kind of background of the name Iris and how you came up with the name.
Sure. So Iris, we thought long and hard for this, but Iris is actually based in Greek mythology. She is the female counterpart of Hermes, and she is the messenger goddess for the gods. And she basically connects the heavens, hell, and earth, and she is also the symbolism of a rainbow. And what we wanted to represent was something positive and something that was reliable and quick. And all of these three themes are what is pretty much symbolic of Iris. The other aspect of it is if you see our logo, we've got a blue E and iris is IRIS and it's in purple. And the blue E is kind of a little nod to the original Internet Explorer. So we thought the E iris would work. But obviously, the iris itself is just it's the symbolism for Greek goddess. Yep.
Lovely. So one of our listeners actually wrote into us and explained a situation that they're experiencing, which is sadly a domestic violence situation. And that is that they've been in a relationship for a long time, but their partner has kind of apps on their phone where they can track their location. And also they use things like baby cams and cat cams in the house to be able to listen to conversations if they have guests around. And essentially have backups of anything on the cloud that they can access. And I think to begin with in this relationship, they explained that this was fine because when they were in a new relationship, they felt like sharing their location with their partner made them feel safe. They didn't really realize the cat cams and the baby cams also had a mic attached. And it's only been in probably recent times, I think probably accelerated by the pandemic, that they now feel a bit unsafe in their home and their relationship. And it would be great to have any advice that you have for anybody in a similar situation or a situation that could end up that way about stalkerware in relationships. We've talked about stranger danger, essentially, but when it's somebody that you live with overstepping and it teetering into abuse, what's the advice there?
For sure. To start off, I want to define stalkerware as well. Yeah. So stalkerware refers to any type of technology. So this can be covert or overt types of technology that can be used to monitor and track anything that the owner of that particular type of technology does. So it can be a phone. It can actually be even a VR headset, actually. Like it can be any type of technology that anyone can use and access. And obviously you've mentioned a couple of the devices that the listener has unfortunately been experiencing the stalking and the spyware on. And they are the most common types as well because they can be remotely accessed if someone is able to access it initially in domestic relationships where domestic abuse and coercive control exists. There is obviously that element of power that the abuser has over the victim. So when you're in a situation where that person already has access to your devices, the stalkerware being present there is significantly more likely because they have access to your devices. They can ask you or demand that of you. And unfortunately, you will have to submit in order to stay alive in most situations or stay in that relationship, which is unfortunate and very, very upsetting to me, especially as well. But generally, they're installed so they can monitor you. But there are other types of technology like air tags and drones and other types of technology that people can sort of just attach to you anywhere. Shared iCloud accounts, I think you mentioned that as well with the listener. These are ones that there is a small rarity that a stranger can access your iCloud and use that against you, but it will primarily be through the coercive control mechanisms in and within your relationships. Obviously, firstly, to the listener, it is a very distressing situation to be in. And like my heart goes out to you because it's so common, and it's just so unfortunate that we live and operate in a society that isn't able to do enough for victims, survivors of this particular type of abuse. The advice that I would give, and obviously this statistic in coercive control and stalkerware in relationships has increased since COVID. The advice that I would give is to build the resilience to have support networks outside of the devices that you use as well. So if you do have the ability to contact people outside of using your particular phone, whether it's using a secondary phone, if you're able to do so, use multi-factor authentication if you can, so you can see whether that person is trying to ping your location, it will send you a text knowing that, okay, they've tried to access your location. There is an element of trust that has obviously been completely broken the second I think someone asks you for your phone and then obviously installs malware on there. That trust is broken. There's obviously, you can still ask your partner for your phone and not do anything about it, and I think that's the element of a very healthy relationship. But obviously in coercive control relationships, that trust is fundamentally broken, and especially as this listener has traveled through life with this person for a significant period of time, when that person does change, it is very difficult to kind of switch on and off. It's very hard, and I do recognize that. I would encourage them to look at the digital rights that they have in their respective country. It's different in every jurisdiction as well. And whether they have any rights specifically that they're able to exercise when it comes to their technology. It's very different in the global south. It's a very, very different in first world countries as well. So educate yourself on that if you are able to. Most websites that do provide you with that information do give you an option in like some corner of the website that says, as soon as you close this website, it will actually delete it from your web browser history. Whoever your abuser is does take a look at your history, that web page will no longer be there. Some applications can also be downloaded very discreetly onto your phone. That is sort of like a help / text-based support for victim survivors. Very similar. It looks like it's interesting because when you think about stalkerware, it can often present the same way as these text-based help apps as well. So the stalkerware itself will present as, some sort of very discreet-looking app, and then you click on it, and then it obviously is tracking everything that you're doing, including hacking your front-face camera or where you are at that particular time.
Just interrupting the conversation with Nakshanthra to remind you that I have a content marketing agency, Alice Violet Creative, specialising in complex brands from the heart of Cheltenham. We work primarily with tech and cyber brands, enabling them to communicate their offering through beautiful storytelling in the form of photography, video, and of course, podcasts. We also offer strategy and full social media management. So if you're looking for those services, do make sure to get in touch. Back to the show.
But these apps also exist where you can download it and you can talk to someone privately and confidentially, and it looks like, a Facetune app or like a collage app or something like that. So there are obviously those use cases for and benefits for discrete types of applications.
Yes.
I think that, like, some more advice, check how interconnected your devices are as well. So people who use home devices like Google Home, Siri, Alexa, a lot of the time your accounts are all connected. So there's an over-reliance again there on a particular router and the original form of like where your Wi-Fi is originating as well. So do we really need to have that? Like, I do understand that like some homes need it, but if you're in a situation like that, I would encourage you, instead of adding devices to your load, maybe reconsider purchasing those devices.
Yeah, I think it's a really tricky one because it kind of goes back to our earlier discussion about victims online, where people would say if you're being trolled or abused or stalked online, stop using the app. And I think in this instance, some listeners might think, well, just unlink the phone, turn off the cat cam. It's not as easy as that. If you are in a situation which could lead to violence, or we don't know the listener's full story here, but the fact that they're saying that they are unable to turn those cameras off and they are unable to remove the tracking devices, I think insinuates to me that there would be a consequence if they did that. So you also have done a lot of work in mental health with online spaces, and you're an advocate for kind of being vulnerable and embracing that. So I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Sure. So I actually have lived experience of both cyberbullying and online harassment, both as a child and as an adult, and it severely impacted my mental health growing up. But also when I experienced online harassment when I was an adult, I realized how much of that childhood trauma affected me when I was an adult and the way that I looked at online spaces. I am someone who has been chronically online since the age of 11. I was on Tumblr and I was exposed to pornography at a young age. I was also on Twitter during the era of very little trust and safety and content moderation. So people were just saying the most nasty things very early on. And obviously as a child, that affects the way your body image and your own relationships as well. That I thought I had the best like online friends. I didn't even know I was talking to, quite frankly. But I just found a community there because I didn't have a community offline when I was in high school. Obviously recovered from that, but I grew up in an age where like Facebook was the big thing. And like I said, I had Facebook, I had Kik, I had Snapchat, I had Instagram, and then proceeded to get every other app that was developed in the last 5 to 8 years. Being in my mid-20s now, I'm like, I just need to have every app that exists out there. But obviously now, like knowing my background, I know to take everything with a grain of salt, and I really do research before I use these applications. But regarding my mental health, I realized that a lot of the time when you do consume these applications, or if you're perpetually online, the way you have lived your life is very different to another person online, and the anonymity really removes any element of accountability. And we don't really consider people's mental health when it comes to accessing these online spaces. We don't give them the opportunity to encourage digital hygiene practices. Even disconnecting from these platforms is often looked down upon in our society. I do take digital breaks and mental health breaks, and I don't publicly announce it on my social media, but when I do talk to people, and they're like, oh, give me your Instagram, or give me your Messenger, or give me your LinkedIn. I'm like, I'm actually not using it right now. You can send me a request and I might get to it in a month. They're like, oh, what's a digital break? And I'm like, I'm prioritizing my mental health because I've realized the overconsumption of certain types of content has really affected the way that I look at myself. That again goes back into the childhood issues that I've had with body image and comparing myself to other people, and where we're at in our lives, and people constantly talking about the next best thing and the next best thing, and chasing the next high and the dopamine hit that they get. And I realize when I'm falling into that trap, I prioritize my mental health. And I always advocate for this in almost every single podcast or seminar or conference or anything that I'm doing. The pillars of online safety are obviously the accountability from big tech and governments and regulators, but also you as the user, you have the ability to disconnect if something is harmful for you as well. It's not obviously the most ideal situation because it shouldn't be there, but you have autonomy and you have every single right to just tap out and go enjoy nature for a bit or read a book, and always prioritize yourself before interacting with the digital world.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting what you said about being completely accessible all the time, because I have my own business, and when I went away earlier this year, emails I just knew I wasn't going to be looking at. But LinkedIn is actually probably my biggest lead generation tool. And it meant that I was still replying all the time, because there's no way of saying that I was on holiday on LinkedIn. And also I wouldn't publicly want to say I was away for safety of my own house and things. So yeah, that's a really interesting thing that I hadn't thought, that even when I am sort of on holiday, I'm still very much on a lot of platforms. Well, thank you so much for this discussion. I'm so pleased that we had it. I knew that there'd be so much to cover, so I really appreciate your time. I do like to ask all of my guests to recommend a book at the end of every episode. So either something you're currently reading, something relevant to the topic, or just your favorite book would be great.
Great question. I actually have the book here. If you don't mind me, I'll just go bring it.
Yeah.
It's a book by Simon Winchester, and it's called Knowing What We Know. The transmission of knowledge from ancient wisdom to modern magic. And it literally talks about the creation of the first encyclopedia to how humans acquire, retain, pass on information. So all the way up until artificial intelligence. And it's just an evolution of history, but also how us as a society, as humans, we've developed from, obviously clay and languages to all these data networks and neural things that we do and operate in our life. And it's such an interesting book. And obviously the last chapter talks so much about future implications and how knowledge may be passed on to generations.
Great recommendation. Well, my recommendation this month is The World of Yesterday by Stefan Zweig, which is an autobiography that he wrote. He's a novelist. He wrote his autobiography just before the end of the war. He's from Austria, back in 1940, I believe. And it was actually the last thing he wrote and then sent to his publisher. And then him and his wife commit suicide because they were Jewish and they were, I think, living in Mexico at the time. And it's basically a love letter to Europe before the wars. And it's a really beautiful book about art, music and literature and the freedom of being in places like Paris before everything happened with Nazi Germany. And it's a really kind of interesting look at the world we're in now, because I feel like we're unfortunately on the precipice of a lot of extremism now as well. And it's quite a timely book and also just beautifully written. And it was actually what inspired Wes Anderson's The Grand Budapest Hotel. The character's based on Stefan. So I'm a big lover of Wes Anderson. So fantastic book as well. Thank you so much for listening to part 2 of this episode with Nakshanthra Suresh. Remember that we did do part 1 on digital footprints, which is about tracking apps and fitness apps like Strava and some other things that you may not have considered that leave a lot more information about you online. We have lots of exciting things coming up. And if you would like to be on the show or recommend a topic that you want us to dive into, do make sure to get in touch. You can email me at info@alicevioletcreative.com. Message us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and we will see what we can do. Thank you so much. Bye.